So in this video, I am taking on the task of trying to watch all 12 of Shakespeare's tragedies, and I've realised that it's a lot more easier and accessible to watch the tragedies than the comedies, because I have another video on my channel going through all 14 comedies, so you can check that out after this one. But I've realised that I think the comedies are a lot more domestic in setting, whereas the tragedies are big scale, dramatic, cinematic. So I feel like they lend themselves a lot better to the kind of film format, which Shakespeare wouldn't have known, because I don't think cinema was that big in the day. Maybe there was a version of film, but I don't think so. And as I'm introducing this, I've actually already started the task of trying to go through the plays already. And initially I thought 12 tragedy plays is going to be so much easier than 14 comedy plays, because 14 is more than 12. But actually, I've realised that the tragedies are some of the lengthiest, longest of Shakespeare's plays, so they're actually quite dense. And also with the comedies, it's sort of like, I guess, how you think about sitcoms. Like, there's common tropes, like you sort of know what to expect once you've gone through some of the comedies, and there's always like mistaken identity, like people dressing up as other people, disguises, they all fall in love in the end. So that's a bit easier to follow, because I think the tragedies seem to be a lot more varied, because the comedies are like predictable little sitcoms, but the tragedies, they're like about real life, and it's portrayed as like messy, passionate romance if there's love there, or there's actually just real life commentary about the human experience, and that's a lot less predictable, and that's a lot more to try to understand. So it's taking a lot longer, and also there is a lot of death, which I feel like is something that I didn't really process before in moving from comedies to tragedies. I should have maybe thought about the fact that there's a lot of death. Like, I've tried to find out the exact death toll throughout all of Shakespeare's plays, and it's actually widely debated, but it's generally considered to be 74 on-stage deaths, and the majority of those are within the tragedies. But actually it varies a lot. Like, Titus Andronicus has 14 deaths, and some of them will have less. But there is actually a lot of variation, because you might think they're all tragedies and they'll all be quite similar, but actually they've got various different themes, various different levels of violence. Some are more like domestic based, about love. Some of them are like, they all just have a different energy to them and a different motivation behind the tragedy, like love, ambition, jealousy, the different negative elements and consequences of the human experience are all explored, and they have a different energy. They also really vary in popularity, because there are the famous ones like the Macbeth, the Romeo and Juliet, the Hamlet, Othello, Julius Caesar, but there's also the ones that we never really talk about. So we're going to unpack all of that, and I feel like I should say I'm not an expert on absolutely everything to do with Shakespeare. Like, I'm just an actor, guys, I'm just an actor. So that's why I'm reading them. I'm trying to go through all of them. So subscribe and stay tuned, because I will be doing the history plays at some point. So please do subscribe. Also, because this is a lot of effort to try and put in a video and share this with people you know who are interested in Shakespeare. But I'm not a historian, so if you disagree with me, find me in the comments. What? I don't know what you want me to do about it. Like, I'm trying my best, and I'm very sorry if I do get things wrong, but it's generally like quite a debated subject anyway, I think, because it's so long ago and people have their different interpretations of things. But I'm just going to share the best that I can, like first impressions, instincts, vibes, introducing you to all of them, because I think it's so hard to know about all the plays and to access this information. I thought I'll make the information publicly available, I'll go through the plays, and I'll also bring you along with me. So let's go. So Romeo and Juliet is potentially one of the most famous Shakespeare plays, one of the most famous tragedies, and if you don't know it, it's about two rival families, the Montagues and the Capulets, and Romeo and Juliet are from opposing families, but they fall in love, so they try to orchestrate a plan where they could end up being together, but it goes wrong and they both end up dying, and lots of other family members end up dying throughout the story, getting killed by each other. So through the tragic death of these young, secret, forbidden lovers, like it's all about forbidden love really, isn't it? Through them dying, the two families are able to reconcile their differences. So actually, as an ending, it's not too tragic, but I thought I'd research because I feel like a lot of people know the plot, so I thought I'd find out more about it, and I found out that there's a famous balcony scene where Romeo is crawling up to Juliet's balcony, but I've realised that in the play it isn't actually specified that there is a balcony. It's just because that's commonly how it's presented, it's just become a part of the play and a part of the storytelling in most versions, basically every version, even though it's not actually written in the play. And also, all of the action happens over only 4 days, which is wild to think that at the start of the 4 days, Romeo is interested in another girl, and then he's dying at the end for the love of Juliet. Like, it's so fast paced, and I feel like we don't think about that fact enough. Like, so much happens in only 4 days. Like, they fall deeply, deeply in love in 4 days. Like, it's a bit fast. And also, I found out that it's based on an earlier Italian story. Like, it's not an original Shakespeare story. It's based on other stories that had been told about these rival families, and like various different variations. Like, not all of the previous versions will contain exactly the same story, but it's based on that. And also, some people say that this play sort of reverses gender roles a bit, because Juliet is such a strong female character, she knows her mind, and also it will have been more of a shock to the kind of Shakespearean audiences to see a girl stabbing herself in love for someone, because that was considered more of like a sort of man's way to die. I guess men sometimes fall on their swords in battle if it's all going wrong, whereas women would use poison. So the fact that Romeo uses poison and that Juliet uses a sword is sort of reversing the kind of gender expectations. And I've seen loads of different versions of Romeo and Juliet because it's put on a lot, but I saw one that was a sort of rap R&B version, and I feel like that's really interesting to think about, because technically the majority of Shakespeare is written in verse, so really leaning into that does really suit that kind of genre and that kind of style, and it makes it really exciting and engaging, because I think too often with Shakespeare people can get caught up in the idea of what Shakespeare should be and should look like and how it should be performed, rather than thinking about the opportunities that the text provides and really using that and really creating something that will really speak to the modern audiences and young people, because there's so many opportunities, but I feel like we often get trapped in an idea of like, this is what Shakespeare has to be, we have to have posh people speaking it in a certain way, whereas really we can really use the verse in a way that connects with people of this current time. So I've read that Macbeth is actually Shakespeare's shortest tragedy, because I think it just has one main narrative really of Macbeth and his pursuit of power and all that goes along with that. And I actually tried to put on my own performance of Macbeth once when I was in like year 8, but there's so many characters that I couldn't do it with like me and 3 friends or whatever it was. But I think it is such an interesting play if you compare it to plays of the time like Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, because it is all about the damage that the pursuit of power can cause, and there's elements of the supernatural in Dr. Faustus and in Macbeth, because there are 3 witches and 3 witches prophesy about Macbeth's future, and then Lady Macbeth gets involved in strategizing and he's killing lots of people in order to get more power, and it's the ambition and then the combination of the guilt of that Lady Macbeth feels that leads her to insanity that is explored, and the fact that maybe blindly pursuing power and following your ambitions is not good for you, because I think that was the moral standpoint of the time. People say that it's representative of the opinions surrounding the gunpowder plot, where people were trying to like explode Parliament, and it's sort of like a moral play about like don't do that kind of thing. But what I do remember is it does have some weird insults, because I think it's Macduff's son gets killed, and as he's getting killed they're like, what, you egg, young fry of treachery, because he's young. And I'm like, why would you say that as you're killing someone? But I think it's meant to be sort of highlighting the fact that killing children is wrong. And then he's like, he has killed me, mother, run away, I pray thee. Like, very articulate for someone who's just been stabbed. But I think it is a really interesting play, and the fact that it doesn't have loads of different strings of different narratives makes it something that is a bit more accessible to put on and be able to have the audience follow along with the story. So Julius Caesar follows the conspiracy to kill Julius Caesar, and then also the aftermath of that and the conflict and fight to gain power when Caesar is gone, and all of the emotions and complexity that surrounds that. And I think it's a really interesting insight into how we sort of try to justify our bad actions to ourselves, because we're always the hero of our own story. So lots of them are saying that they really love Caesar, and they're saying, I love Caesar but I love Rome more, and they're trying to convince themselves that they did the right thing. And it's all about trying to sway public opinion, gain support for yourself. And it's interesting to see the way men are presented as well, because these men who are conspiring to kill Julius Caesar are worried politically, but they're also really ambitious, and they're really, really jealous of Caesar, and presenting that kind of male insecurity on stage in what is such a play about battles and violence as well is really interesting to present masculinity in that kind of complex way. And Brutus and Cassius are some of the main conspirators, and I think they're brother-in-laws, and it's really interesting to see the portrayal of such deep male friendship, and they go through such highs and lows, and it's so intense to go through a conspiracy to kill someone of such power, and it brings them into such an interesting deep relationship that they have together afterwards. And I think that's really interesting to see. But I feel like this play feels very human, like we're all very morally complicated, and also there is humour found throughout. Like there's a cobbler and he's making jokes about souls, like he's doing wordplay on like the soles of a shoe and like human souls. So even within dark times we still do find humour, and we still do negotiate with like our feelings about our actions and what we've done and what's happened to us. And I feel like it feels very grounded in reality, and I find it a really interesting play. And also the Friends, Romans, Countrymen speech is very famous, and that's in this play. So King Lear is a play that I found deeply difficult, sad, tragic, uncomfortable, unenjoyable to watch. Like it's a painful watch because it is so tragic. And I've looked up about it and I've realised that actually for almost 200 years someone else rewrote it to be a little bit lighter and a little bit happier and an easier watch, just because it is historically widely considered to be probably the most difficult play out of all of Shakespeare's plays to watch. And the discomfort in viewing it both comes from the actual goriness, like there is someone who has their eyes gouged out and then they are still alive and feature in the rest of the play after having been treated like that. And also emotionally, there are some really loyal characters and their loyalty is never rewarded, and everyone's having an absolutely horrible time, and no one's happy, and it's actually just really a sad play. So the main plotline surrounds King Lear, and he's getting older, so he wants to divide his kingdom equally between his 3 daughters, but first he wants them to say how much they love him. So the oldest 2 daughters give really big speeches, just like really going over the top, and then Cordelia, the youngest, doesn't really want to play that game, and she's like, yeah, I do love you, but like she doesn't like elaborate. She just is the honest girl that she is, and because of that she is cut from the will, and then she ends up getting married, but then later reuniting with her dad, because actually the people who he gives his kingdom to, his 2 daughters, actually treat him really badly, and he's old and confused, and they leave him out in a storm and don't really look after him. So I think this is a theme that, like, even people nowadays, there's lots of people who have like family inheritance debates and debates surrounding like the care of older relatives as they're getting like more confused and they're struggling with things. So it's still really relevant, and the discomfort within the play could be used to make some really interesting viewing and some really interesting points about society now. However, it's not like I didn't like enjoy watching it, because it's like I couldn't watch too much of it in one go because it's very heavy, and also it is confusing because lots of these characters end up being in disguise for like their own safety, or because someone's actually upset with them or something. So it's like hard to follow in that kind of way. And there's also a plot line about 2 brothers, and one, Edmund, is illegitimate and Edgar is legitimate, so there's a lot of conflict to do with that. And Edmund has a famous speech about like baseness and like being an illegitimate child, like a child outside of wedlock, was a big deal back in the day. So that's a speech that a lot of people I've seen bring to auditions, and it's a really interesting one. So Othello is probably best known for being potentially the most famous play ever about the theme of jealousy, because this man, Iago, is so jealous of Othello, so he works to convince Othello that his really nice wife is cheating on him. So then eventually, like, because back in the day that was such a big thing, and all this to do with chastity and all of that was such a big thing, so he ends up killing her, and then he finds out that she wasn't even ever cheating on him, and it was just all a plot by Iago. So it's really interesting psychologically to think about how someone gets to that point where they're so convinced of something that's not true. However, I knew that this is a tragedy like basically all the tragedies where people die, but what surprised me about this is that it actually has a really slow pace. I think people often say because they're establishing the characters and the dynamics and the relationships, and they're slowly changing and people are questioning each other, but actually no deaths happen until like the very, very end. And also there's a scene where Othello's wife Desdemona and Iago's wife Emilia are having a chat together about men and like different affairs and stuff, and it very much feels like a kind of girls' chat, and it feels very much like the female voice is quite strongly and accurately presented. That's how a lot of women feel about that kind of scene, which is interesting because I feel like that's sort of rare to sometimes find accurately presented by a male writer, let alone a male writer hundreds of years ago, when women's voices were a lot more silenced. And also, Othello is specified to be a black man, so he does experience racism. So there's lots of debates about whether or not like presenting racism on stage is meaning that Shakespeare is creating a racist play, or is he highlighting the issues with racism within society, because it's hard to know the context of when he was writing it as well, but seeing black men in positions of power back in the day wasn't all that common, and Othello is presented as being really honourable and having good morals, and yes, he gets swayed by Iago, but Iago's an evil white man. So I have done a lot of research about that, and I still don't really know where Shakespeare was trying to get at with that. But then the fact that he's presenting black men on stage as like honourable and well respected and good morals and as the hero of the story, even though he does kill his wife at the end, that was very much something that was not really done and not really presented in the day. And also, I didn't really know before this that Iago kills his wife, Othello kills his wife. It's very much about male violence against women, and I think that's very much something that's talked about nowadays as well. Unfortunately, it's still something that very much happens. The men who say they love you could then kill you kind of fear that women have to consider. So when I started watching Antony and Cleopatra, I intended to just watch like a little bit, just make a start on it. And I proceeded to watch the whole thing that day because I think it's a really exciting plot. And actually, I think Antony and Cleopatra feels more romantic than a lot of the comedies that are about weddings at the end, because lots of the comedies are giving low-level arranged marriage vibes, whereas Antony and Cleopatra, it's a passionate, messy affair with two of the biggest world leaders at the time. And Cleopatra has such control, even though she's a woman. Like in lots of the other marriages throughout Shakespeare plays, the women are a bit more like quiet and like they do whatever the man says, whereas Cleopatra has so much control. So Antony is Mark Antony, who actually is in power at the end of Julius Caesar. So this sort of feels like a sequel to Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony is having an affair with Cleopatra, and then he gets the news that his wife back home has died, and then he's off again, and Cleopatra's thinking about this man that she loves all the time, and then she hears that he's married Octavia Caesar, sort of a political marriage, because I guess Julius Caesar's died, and in order to keep the peace and to cement ties to the Caesar people, it's sort of like he marries politically, but he doesn't love her, so he does go back to Cleopatra and have this affair, but then that leads to a lot more conflict and a lot more battles. So there's war, there's passionate affairs with world leaders, and it just feels like the stakes are so high, so much happens, and it's so intense. So this is another Roman play, but it's a less popular Roman play because I think the main character is a lot harder to connect with, because he's a very strong military persona, but he's not very good at winning over public opinion. Like, that doesn't really bother him, and he's got a temper to him. He says what he feels. He also at one point disregards his entire family and still wants to destroy the city where they live, and he's just got so much anger, and we don't hear from him very much. I think he's only got about like one soliloquy or something like that, whereas other plays have the main character speaking to the audience more often, so you can understand them a bit more. But I think because he's so difficult to connect with, it's a more challenging play for people to get on board with, because you can't connect with him at all and understand why he would for so long not consider his mother, his wife, and his son. Like, that doesn't really bother him too much, and he's quite aggressive. However, it is also a play that probably is less popular because it has been banned throughout history, because it's such a strong sort of portrayal of the military. So it was banned post-war in Germany and also in 1930s France as well, because it's just such a militant kind of play, I believe is why it was banned. So Cymbeline is a play that I have the book of, so I took the opportunity to read it because I used it for my drama school auditions in my first or second year of auditioning, so there are some nice monologues from Imogen. It's an interesting play because it doesn't seem the most known and popular, but when I did my research, actually, in the centuries between now and Shakespeare's day, it actually was quite popular, and you forget that the plays that are popular now weren't necessarily the plays that were popular back in the day or in the 18th century, but it's sort of considered to be Shakespeare's parody of himself. Like, there's so many different specific Shakespearean tropes and features that are commonly found in his play, but some people argue that it lacks depth, and people think it seems like Shakespeare's got writer's block in this play and it's not as good quality as some of his other ones. But it is an interesting play. It features Wales, which I don't know if Wales is in that many Shakespearean plays. And the play has an evil stepmother in it, which is very interesting because that feels like something that you see quite a lot in a pantomime. And also some of the violence in this play is quite sudden, and almost like the suddenness and unexpectedness of the escalation of the violence sort of makes it feel less serious and more sort of comedic, because the queen's son, so her son from a previous marriage, is annoying. So purely because he's annoying, he gets beheaded so suddenly, which is mad and interesting, and it's sort of confusing genre-wise because it's classed as a tragedy in the first folio, probably because the circumstances surrounding the play are quite tragic, whereas really it ends more like a comedy. Like, the rest of it's more like a comedy, it's just got tragic circumstances surrounding some of it, so I'd argue that it feels more like a comedy, really. And something that I think is nice though is that although the queen is scheming to try and get her son on the throne, and she's like a dangerous, scary, cunning woman, she is also quite smart, and her son is described as, I think, actually described as an idiot by some people. So including smart women and silly men is interesting because it's not what you often expect from plays of the period. But there are some quite rogue plot points in this play, like the king's sons have been child snatched when they were younger and brought up as someone else's kids, which is a bit rogue. And also the king's daughter has married a man who the king sort of disapproves of her marrying, and he gets banished, and then he's hanging out with Italian people because he's been banished, and he's placing bets on how loyal he believes his wife Imogen to be, and he sends an Italian man to try and seduce her to prove that she's really loyal, which feels weird when it's sort of, I love this girl and my girl's great and I am using that to fuel my competition with other men about their women, rather than just allowing her to have a nice time. Like, why is he trying to ruin her day by sending an Italian man to seduce her when she doesn't want that? This Italian man is so determined to be believed to have legitimately won the bet that after he gets rejected by Imogen, he goes into her bedroom while she's sleeping and tries to find enough evidence, memorize enough things that everyone will believe that he did sleep with her, which is so creepy. Like, this play is so rogue. So, I mean, it's an interesting journey to go through as a story, is what I'm trying to say. So maybe check it out for that. So I've watched Troilus and Cressida, and it's one of those things where you watch it and then you reflect and you're like, what have I just watched? Because it's very different in vibe to lots of his other plays, because people sometimes describe it as a satire, and it's sort of a cynical portrayal of love and war, because Troilus and Cressida confess love to each other, and then Cressida is very unfaithful, and it's all about lust and like getting with loads of people rather than actual love. And it's set in the Trojan War, so there's like Helen of Troy and all of these characters, which I assume maybe Shakespearean audiences will be quite familiar with. I'm personally not the most familiar with the Trojan War, but maybe some people are. But I think I've seen, because it's a lesser known play, and also because it's got these big themes of like lust and war, and it's not like the usual kind of shallow falling in love at first sight and we stay loyal and have a happy ever after kind of like comedy vibe of Shakespeare's comedies. It's more cynical and it's more explicit as well. I feel like it's got that kind of humour, and Cressida's uncle is there with Troilus and Cressida the whole time being like, that's enough words now, like when are we gonna like get together? And I'm like, what is this? What is this? Like, I was quite perplexed. I didn't know what was going on. It feels like when you're on a night out and you're just having a normal conversation with someone and then someone's drunk there being like, get together now. Like, her uncle Pandarus is just trying to organise all of these affairs, make everyone get together with everyone, and it's just quite unhinged and quite also more like modern dating maybe than the more kind of formal falling in love and staying together forever kind of comedies vibe. So it provides a different kind of energy, and also they test Cressida's loyalty because like loads of the people, when she gets transferred to another camp, like loads of people try to kiss her, and it's all just like a bit odd, but it's also in very tragic circumstances. So it's sort of, there's a contrast between all of these wild things that are going on with the characters and like the comedy elements that are found within the play, as some people see, whilst also it having a tragic setting, because like people would expect it to be very tragic and very serious, but actually there are elements of comedy that contrast your expectations with the setting. So it's an interesting one, it's a confusing one, and I think it's got mixed opinions related to it, but I think it's sometimes more interesting to have that kind of confessing you love someone and then running off and like seeing all these other people and like all of this other stuff going on. It's more like messy real life rather than the sort of two-dimensional we meet and we don't know each other but we love each other already and we stay together forever, which you see in plays like As You Like It and some of those comedies where they love each other and you don't really know why. So I would say that Hamlet is potentially Shakespeare's most famous play, and as a result of that there's so many different adaptations of it. I watched one where Hamlet is Ian McKellen during lockdown, which is interesting because Hamlet's usually like a younger man, but Ian McKellen is a phenomenal Shakespearean actor, one of the best, and watching him do these famous speeches, it's crazy because it seems like he's just turned to you and he's just like saying it and it's his own words. Like, it feels real. And it doesn't feel like he's putting on a big performance. It feels like they're his words and he's saying them for the first time. And it's stunning and incredible. And I definitely think that it's worth at least like seeing a little bit of it. And also there's a show I watched called Becoming Hamlet, which is where two very well established, respected actors who have both previously played Hamlet meet up to discuss the role and how to portray such a famous role and such famous speeches truthfully. So as an actor, I find that a really, really useful resource to have. And Hamlet is interesting because he has 7 soliloquies, which means it's just like him with his thoughts, like talking to the audience or whatever, like it's just his speeches. So he's very introspective and he thinks about stuff, and it's very psychological in that kind of way. Like, Hamlet is experiencing grief, he's experiencing all of these different feelings and thoughts and desires for revenge, and he pretends to be mad as well and then seeks to get revenge, and he sees ghosts and stuff, and there's violence but there's also deep introspection and deep thought, and he's going through a lot mentally, and there's sort of just an uneasy feeling surrounding the whole play. So Timon of Athens, I think, is an incredibly underrated play, but I think it's because genre-wise it's quite confusing because it's got such comedy moments and also deep tragedy, because Timon of Athens is basically about this man Timon, although it can be played by a woman and was played by a woman in the RSC version, and Timon is really generous and is always putting on fancy banquets and like giving jewels to his friends, and then Timon ends up in a huge amount of debt, and Timon's like, well, I've got all these friends who I've given so much to and they're wearing the jewels that I've given them, so they will just give me enough to get me out of debt. but then they don't. And then actually, this is a spoiler, so skip like 10-20 seconds if you don't want to hear, but then Timon like dies after living in it, I think it's a cave, and never really going back to society, but feeling incredibly bitter about everything that's happened. So I think it's an interesting commentary, because I was thinking we don't actually have that much theatre and that many films about those kind of dynamics, because often there's such a commentary on like who pays for different things and like the balance of effort and money and finances within friendships and people you know. And Timon is so generous, and people aren't generous back to Timon, and they're just taking. And then they're like, oh, we told you were spending too much. So it's really interesting to see the levels of care and responsibility and the differences between that people take on for people that they know and people in their community. So it's a really interesting social commentary, I think. And I think it's often misinterpreted because there's this deep tragic element, but actually Timon's really witty and has great insults. Like, when Timon's really bitter, Timon's really feisty, and Timon puts on a fake banquet for all the friends after the initial banquet. And Timon uses quite a lot of the funny Shakespearean insults that Shakespeare's sometimes known for. And I think actually, instead of thinking of it as like an intense tragedy when Timon's lost everything and is like in the cave in the woods, like you can sort of see it as some kind of like satirical melodrama commentary on society, I think is a better way of seeing it. But something that I should mention is that, as well as seeing the RSC version is recorded, so I watched a recording of it, I also saw Rendered Retina perform live, and they do like an hour-long version with music and songs. And I've interviewed Jordan from Rendered Retina 3 times on this channel, and they're just an incredible theatre company. They bring like the underrated plays. I think they're on a little bit of a break at the moment. I don't know if or when they'll come back, but they've got content out about the kind of performances they've done, and they just make it so funny and so accessible with the songs and the music. And they made me love Timon, and they made me even more interested in Shakespeare, and they're just a lovely set of people. So definitely go give their accounts a follow and see if they come back to the theatre live and see what they're doing, because they do such an incredible version, and they do have content about Timon of Athens, and I can also link to the interview where they're talking about Timon of Athens as well. So I've left this play until last because I've heard terrifying things about like hose pipes of blood, or like covering the audience members on the front row in plastic sheets, because there's so much blood in this play that they need to sort of protect the audience members from being absolutely stained with blood by the end of it, because it has one of the highest death tolls in Shakespearean plays. It's got 14, which I don't know if that's quite high. I don't really know what to compare it to these days, because a death toll of like 14 within less than 3 hours seems like quite an intense thing. Because also, if you consider what else goes on in this play, there are amputations, there is cannibalism, there is assault, there are affairs, there's basically every single trigger warning you could ever think of, and then sort of like add a few more niche ones. That's basically this play. But what I've heard is that in Elizabethan times, and this is one of Shakespeare's earlier plays, in the Elizabethan times it was really popular to have really blood-filled plays, like revenge tragedies. They wanted to see plays about betrayal and treason. And they also really liked Roman plays, and that sense of it being like a little bit separated from them. So Titus Andronicus is set in the Roman times, but it's actually a fictional man called Titus Andronicus. He's not actually real compared to like Coriolanus. He's a real man. And who else is there? There's Julius Caesar's real. There's Antony and Cleopatra is based on real people, but Titus Andronicus is fake. Probably explains the fact that he's meant to have 25 sons and 1 daughter, which is very imbalanced. But at the start of the play, he's lost 21 sons in battle, so he has 4 sons left and 1 daughter. And there's actually too much to say about this play, so I'll just give you a brief introduction, but I think what's interesting about it is that it's set in like the Roman courts, it's set in the woods, there's battles, there's fights, like it's quite cinematic and it's quite bold and it's quite theatrical, and I think it really entertains audiences of the time because it's very much the kind of genre that was popular. So it's very much like his sort of commercialized play, like it's what would sell tickets and get his name out there, I guess. I could be wrong, but I think because it's an early play, he's really playing into what was popular at the time. And it's mad as a play because his daughter, Titus Andronicus' daughter, gets assaulted by two brothers, but her tongue's cut out, her hands are amputated, and she struggles to communicate this. And by the time she does, they then kill these two brothers that did this to her, and they cook them and feed them in a pie to his mother, and then like everyone gets killed, and he kills his daughter in the end because he's like, her honour's been ruined, like her life isn't really worth living anymore, which is mad and victim blaming and wrong, but like I think it's for the drama, like they want to have a lot of death and death without too much consequence and regret. Like there are sad moments, like he's telling the sorrows to some stones because he doesn't want to tell his sorrows to people, as Titus Andronicus, and he goes a bit mad. Like there's lots of these different dramatic tropes in there and tragic tropes that you can see throughout the tragedies, but like there's less of the sort of reflection and consequence of violence in the sort of psychological reflective sense because it's so actively violent all of the time. So it's a big contrast to stuff like Hamlet or Macbeth, where they're really thinking about the consequences of the actions in great detail. So I've now finished watching all 12 tragedies, so I thought I'd evaluate the process and talk about how I found it, because to be honest, I think it surprised me because even though there's only 12 tragedies and there's 14 comedies, I think I found the comedies a lot easier because they're shorter and they're more sort of like formulaic. They're like a little predictable rom-com. There's a couple and you can sort of connect the characters to the couple in various different ways, so they all connect up a bit easier, whereas I feel like there's certain side characters that I struggle to follow in the tragedies because it's harder to connect because there's less of a formula and all of these plays are so different. Like there's some characters that only appear very occasionally and it's hard to place them in the grand scheme of the play, because I think the tragedies tend to be a bit longer and also they're a lot more varied. Like you have your psychological dramas like Hamlet and Macbeth, you have your really gory tragedies like Titus Andronicus, you have your Roman historical tragedies, like there's a few of them actually, but you have quite a lot of them, and then you also have your romantic tragedies like Romeo and Juliet, and it is quite varied as a genre. So because it's less predictable, and you have like those more sort of like family dramas as well, like King Lear, like you don't know what to expect, so you're sort of learning how to interpret the story and like learning about new Shakespearean features, whereas the comedies, there's a lot of common tropes of like there's characters who are in disguise, they all fall in love and get married at the end. Like it's a lot more predictable, so you're able to work out some of the other bits, whereas I feel like this is a level up and it's harder. But I love that I've been able to learn about the tragedies because I feel like I have really noticed in auditions that when people are bringing classical speeches, I have a familiarity with a lot of the plays that they're doing. But please, please, please do subscribe because this has taken a lot of effort and a lot of time and it's been quite the journey, and I might go into the histories in the future. However, I'm thinking I might go to Christopher Marlowe, Shakespeare's biggest competitor, had 6 plays. That feels a bit more manageable, and it's also interesting to compare him to some of his contemporaries at the time. So I think I want to read other playwrights as well of the time But if you have any more sort of like classical play content that you'd like to see from me, please let me know in the comments. Please share this video around with anyone who you think might want to be part of that kind of Shakespearean tragedies discussion, because it's nice to be able to have a space to be able to talk openly and learn even more about Shakespeare, because he is a big name, isn't he? And it's nice to be able to know what everyone's on about. But let me know what you think about the plays that you know in the comments, and let's chat all things Shakespeare. And thank you so much to everyone for watching, and hopefully see you in more content soon. Bye!